Hello, classmates. Today, we begin to study controversies in trade policy. It involves two issues: globalization and low-wage labor, and globalization and the environment. In this lecture, we will study globalization and low-wage labor, focusing on two contents: the trade and wages, labor standards, and the trade negotiations. First, trade and wages. In the 1990s, a heated dispute arose over the effects of global international trade on workers in developing countries, and whether trade agreements should include standards for wage rates and labor conditions. This dispute was often widened into a broader debate about the effects of globalization. It was a debate played out not just in academic journals, but also in some cases in the street. Why did it happen? What's behind the dispute? It may be lies in the rising of manufactured exports from developing countries. The rise of manufactured exports from developing countries has been one of the major shifts in the world economy over the last generation. Even a displaced poor nation like Bangladesh, with a per capita GDP less than 5% that of the United States, now relies more on exports of manufactured goods than on exports of traditional agricultural or mineral products. Should the low wages and the poor working conditions be a cause for concern? Many people think so. For example, some activists pointed to the example of Mexico McDonald's factories near the US border that had expanded rapidly, roughly doubling in employment in the 5 years following the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement. Wages in those factories were in the same cases below $5 per day, and the conditions were terrible by US standards. Opponents of the free trade argued that by making it easier for employers to replace high-wage workers in the United States with low-paid workers in Mexico, the agreement had hurt labor on both sides of the border. The above claim can be true, but we cannot conclude that trade occurs workers. The Ricardian model predicts that while wages in Mexico should remain lower than those in the United States due to low productivity in Mexico, they will rise relative to the pre-trade level. Look at table 1. Suppose there are two countries, the United States and Mexico, and the two industries, high-tech and low-tech. We also assume that labor is the only factor of production, and that US labor is more productive than Mexico labor in all industries. Specifically, it takes only 1 hour of US labor to produce a unit of output in either industry. It takes 2 hours of Mexican labor to produce a unit of low-tech output and 8 hours to produce a unit of high-tech output. So we could calculate the real wages of workers in each country in terms of each good before trade. The real wage in each case is simply the quantity of each good that a worker could produce in 1 hour. So real wage in the United States in each industry is 1. In Mexico, the real wage of high-tech goods is 1/8. The real wage in low-tech goods is 1/2. Now suppose that the trade is opened. In the equilibrium after trade, the relative wage rates of US and Mexican workers would be somewhere between the relative productivity of workers in the two industries. We assume US wages is 4 times Mexican wages. Thus, it would be cheaper to produce low-tech goods in Mexico and high-tech goods in the United States. A critic of globalization might look at this trading equilibrium and conclude that trade workers against the interest of workers. First of all, in low-tech industries, highly paid jobs in the United States were replaced with lower paid jobs in Mexico. Moreover, you could make a plausible case that the Mexican workers were underpaid, although they are half as productive in low-tech manufacturing as the United States workers they replace. The wage rate is only 1/4, not 1/2, that of US workers. But in this example, the purchasing power of wage has actually increased in both countries. US workers, all of whom are now employed in high-tech, can purchase more low-tech goods than before. 2 units per hour of worker versus 1. Mexican workers, all of whom are now employed in low-tech, find that they can purchase more high-tech goods with an hour labor than before. 1/4 instead of 1/8. Because of trade, the price of each country's imported good in terms of that country's wage rate has fallen. One might argue that this model is misleading because it assumes that labor is the only factor of production. It is true that if one turns from the Ricardian model to the factor proportion model, the case for believing that trading is beneficial to workers in the low-wage country actually becomes stronger. Standard economic analysis says that while workers in a capital-abundant nation like the United States might be hurt by trade with a labor-abundant country like Mexico, the workers in labor-abundant country should benefit from a shift in the distribution of income in their favor. In the specific case of the multilaterals, economists argue that while wages in the multilaterals are very low compared with wages in the United States, that situation is inevitable because the lack of other opportunities in Mexico, which has far lower overall productivity. And it follows that while wages and working conditions in the microlaterals may appear terrible, they represent an improvement over the alternatives available in Mexico. The standard economist argument, in other words, is that despite the low wages earned by workers in developing countries, those workers are better off than they would have been if globalization had not taken place. Some activists do not accept this argument. They maintain that increased trade makes workers in both advanced and developing countries worse off. It is hard, however, to find a clear statement of the channels through which this is supposed to happen. Perhaps the most popular argument is that capital is mobile internationally, while labor is not, and that this mobility gives capitalists a bargaining advantage. Second, labor standards and trade negotiations. Free trade proponents and anti-globalization activists may debate the big questions such as, is globalization good for workers or not? Narrower practical policy issues are at stake. However, whether and to what extent international trade agreements should also contain provisions aimed at improving wages and working conditions in poor countries. The most modest proposals have come from economists who argue for a system that monitors wages and working conditions and makes the results of this monitoring available to consumers. The argument is a version of the market failure analysis. Suppose they suggest that consumers in advanced countries feel better about buying manufactured goods that they are now were produced by decently paid workers. Then a system that allows those consumers to know without expending large efforts on information gathering whether the workers were indeed decently paid offers an opportunity for mutual gains. Because consumers can choose to buy only certified goods, they are better off because they feel better about their purchases. Meanwhile, workers in the certified factories gain a better standard of living than they otherwise would have had. Proponents of such a system admit that it would not have a large impact on the standard of living in developing countries, mainly because it would affect only the wages of the workers in export factories, who are a small minority of the workforce, even in highly export-oriented economies. But they argue that it would do some good and little harm. A strong step would be include formal labor standards as part of trade agreements. Such standards have considerable political support in advanced countries. The economic argument in favor of labor standards in trade agreements is similar to argument in favor of a minimum wage rate for domestic workers, while economic theory suggests that the minimum wage reduces the number of low-skill jobs available. Some reasonable economists argue that such effects are small and are outweighed by the effect of the minimum wage in raising the income of the workers who remain employed. Economists are sometimes skeptical about such concerns for foreign workers, however, and they will attempt to enforce minimum labor standards as a form of disguised protection in industrial countries. A particular concern is that labor standards would be used as the basis for private lawsuits against foreign companies, similar to the way anti-dumping legislation has been used by private company harass foreign competitors. Whether you agree with these sentiments or not, economics teaches that we need to be careful that enforcing labor standards abroad does not worsen the situation for foreign workers by leading to unemployment. That's all for this lecture. Thanks for joining. See you next time.